Maria had always been called simple and not in the kind way. She grew up in a small town where people remembered every rumor more than they remembered a neighbor's kindness. She was not the kind of woman who wore bright clothes or spoke loudly in gatherings. She kept her head down, worked hard, and tried not to bother anyone. Yet somehow she became the subject of whispers. People said she was slow, that she had no ambition, that she was useless. The cruelest word of all stuck to her like a stain she could not wash away: worthless. She worked in a small bakery on the corner of the market street, waking before dawn every day to knead dough, light the ovens, and prepare the bread that would feed the very same people who mocked her. The owner paid her little, just enough to keep her from starving, and he too looked at her with eyes that said he was doing her a favor. Sometimes when customers came in, they would smirk when they saw her fumbling with the change or struggling to carry a heavy tray, and someone would whisper, "That one, she'll never be anything." She heard it enough times that the words became a kind of cruel lullaby, following her into her sleep. Still she endured. Life had not given her much. Her parents gone too soon, no brothers or sisters to defend her, no husband to stand beside her, but she carried on quietly. She believed if she worked hard enough, someday something might change. Yet years passed and nothing did. The bakery's walls felt more like a prison than a workplace. Her hands became calloused, her back ached, but her pay never grew, and neither did the respect she received. Some days she thought perhaps everyone was right. Perhaps she truly was worthless. One winter morning, a heavy snow had fallen overnight, covering the streets in thick white blankets. Maria rose before the sun, wrapped herself in her worn shawl, and trudged through the cold to the bakery. Her breath clouded in the air as she pushed open the shop door. Inside, the old radio hummed softly. She worked in silence, her thoughts as heavy as the dough she pounded on the wooden counter. The bakery owner had been more irritable than usual, muttering about profits and waste. When Maria accidentally burned a tray of rolls, he snapped at her so harshly that even the customers looked away in discomfort. "You're useless," he spat, loud enough for everyone to hear. The word cut through her chest like a knife. That night she went home with tears frozen on her cheeks. She had no firewood left, so she sat in the dark, huddled under thin blankets, whispering to herself that tomorrow would somehow be better. But deep down she wondered how many tomorrows she could survive like this. Unknown to her, far away in the capital, preparations were being made for a grand national program. The president had recently announced a new initiative to recognize the invisible workers of the country: the cleaners, the farmers, the bakers, the seamstresses, ordinary people who quietly kept the nation alive but were never acknowledged. His team was gathering stories from across the country, looking for lives that reflected resilience and sacrifice. A young volunteer traveling through Maria's town happened to stop by the bakery for bread. He noticed Maria's tired hands, her quiet way of serving customers, and the way the owner barked orders at her. Curious, he asked her a few questions. She blushed, embarrassed by the attention, and answered simply that she had been working there for nearly 20 years. She did not complain about her hardships, she did not ask for pity, she just said she tried to do her best every day. The volunteer saw something in her that others overlooked: dignity and persistence. He wrote her name down in his notes and left, promising nothing. Maria thought little of it afterward. People always came and went, and promises rarely meant anything in her world. Weeks later, just as the chill of winter began to fade, Maria returned home one evening to find a crowd gathered outside her small apartment. Neighbors whispered excitedly, pointing at her door. Confused, she pushed through and stepped inside. Her old telephone, rarely touched except for calls from the bakery, was ringing. She picked it up with trembling hands, expecting it to be her employer scolding her again. Instead, a calm, commanding voice greeted her. "Good evening, is this Maria?" Her knees nearly gave way. She recognized the voice from speeches broadcast on the radio. It was the president himself. She stammered, unable to respond. The voice continued warmly, "I have heard of your dedication, your years of work, and your quiet strength. You have been chosen as one of the people this nation will honor." Maria clutched the phone, sure she was dreaming. She looked around her bare room, at the cracked walls and broken chair, and could not believe the most powerful man in the country was speaking to her. The president went on to tell her that she would be invited to the capital, that her story had touched many, and that from now on, her life would no longer be the same. Maria did not remember how she answered, or even if she managed to form words. When the call ended, she sat frozen, the receiver still pressed against her ear. Neighbors rushed in, shouting questions, trying to confirm what they had heard. The news spread like wildfire through the town. The same people who had once branded her worthless now looked at her with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. Children ran through the streets chanting her name. Even the bakery owner came by, stammering awkward congratulations, though his eyes revealed his discomfort. Maria could hardly process it. She had been invisible all her life, and now suddenly the nation's highest office had reached down to lift her into the light. That night she did not sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the stars, whispering to herself that perhaps at last, tomorrow truly would be different. The days that followed felt like living inside a dream Maria had never dared to imagine. For the first time in her life, people came to her not with sneers or pity but with admiration. Reporters appeared outside her door, asking questions, holding microphones close to her face, taking photographs of the woman who had once been dismissed as nothing. She did not know how to answer their questions. Her words were simple, her voice soft, yet the world seemed eager to hear even the smallest detail about her life. At the bakery, customers suddenly treated her differently. Some smiled at her, some shook her hand, and a few even apologized for the years of unkindness. The bakery owner, who once barked orders and treated her like a burden, now addressed her as "Madam" in front of others, his tone dripping with false respect. Maria saw through it, but she no longer trembled at his voice. Something deep inside her had shifted the moment the president called her name. She felt a quiet strength she had never known before, as if the heavy chains of shame and invisibility that had bound her for decades had fallen away. Yet even as the town's view of her changed overnight, she could not escape the years of pain that still lingered within her. Each praise felt strange, almost uncomfortable, as though it belonged to someone else. She still saw herself as the tired woman kneading dough at dawn, the girl mocked by neighbors, the worker told she was useless. Could a phone call truly erase a lifetime of wounds? She was not sure. One morning, a black car with tinted windows stopped in front of her building. A well-dressed man stepped out, holding an envelope sealed with the national emblem. He introduced himself as an aide from the president's office and handed her the letter. Inside was an official invitation to the Capitol. She was to attend a ceremony where she would be honored as one of the nation's pillars of perseverance, a program designed to celebrate ordinary citizens whose quiet labor sustained the country. Maria read the words again and again, her hands trembling. She had never traveled beyond the neighboring town, let alone to the capital city. Fear gripped her chest, fear of being out of place, of being laughed at again, of not knowing how to behave among powerful people. But the aide reassured her that everything would be arranged. Transportation, lodging, even clothing. All she had to do was accept. Maria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Somewhere in her heart, she realized this was not just about her. This was a chance to show that even someone branded worthless could be seen as valuable. The journey to the capital was unlike anything she had experienced. She was driven in a car more luxurious than any she had ever touched, its seats soft, the world outside rushing past her window like a blur of colors and lights. When they entered the city, she could hardly breathe. The skyscrapers seemed to touch the heavens, and the streets overflowed with people, vehicles, and sounds. It felt like another world entirely, far from her quiet town and the bakery's flour-dusted walls. At the hotel, she was escorted to a room so large she could hardly believe it was meant for her alone. There were thick carpets beneath her feet, a bed big enough for 3 people, and mirrors that reflected her uncertain expression from every angle. For a long time she simply sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, whispering to herself that this was real, that she was truly here. The next morning, a team arrived to prepare her for the ceremony. Tailors measured her for a dress, stylists brushed her hair until it shone, and someone even applied gentle makeup to her face. She hardly recognized herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked dignified, graceful, almost regal, yet her eyes still carried the humility of someone who had lived a life of hardship. She thought of her parents, of how proud they might have been if they could see her now, and for the first time in years tears slipped down her cheeks, not from pain but from gratitude. The ceremony was held in a grand hall, filled with golden chandeliers and polished marble floors. Hundreds of people were present: officials, diplomats, families of the honorees, and the press. Maria felt her heart pounding so hard she feared it might burst. When her name was announced, the hall erupted in applause. She walked slowly to the stage, her steps uncertain but steady, her eyes wide with awe. And then she saw him, the president, standing tall, smiling warmly as he extended his hand to her. In that moment, all the whispers of worthlessness that had haunted her seemed to dissolve. She took his hand, and he spoke words she would never forget. "This nation is built on the strength of people like you. Your work, your perseverance, your dignity, they are not invisible. Today we honor you, and through you we honor all who have been overlooked." The audience rose to their feet, applauding loudly. Maria's body trembled, but her spirit soared higher than ever before. When she returned to her seat, holding the medal that had been placed around her neck, she felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. She was still the same Maria who had lived in poverty, who had been called useless, yet she was also now something else. An emblem of resilience, a reminder to others that no one is truly worthless. She looked around the hall at the other honorees, a farmer with weathered hands, a seamstress who had worked for decades, a teacher from a remote village. All of them had been invisible in their own ways, yet here they were, recognized at last. For Maria, the ceremony was not just an honor, it was a rebirth. She realized that even if tomorrow she returned to her simple life, she would never again believe the lies that had been forced upon her. She knew now that her life mattered, that her existence carried weight. And though the applause eventually faded and the lights dimmed, something inside her had been lit that could never again be extinguished. Maria's return to her hometown after the ceremony was unlike anything she had ever known. The same streets that once echoed with whispers about her worthlessness now filled with cheers, handshakes, and clapping hands that reached out to touch her as if she carried a blessing. Neighbors who had ignored her for years crowded her door, bringing gifts of food, flowers, and warm smiles. Even children who used to laugh behind her back now ran to her side, begging to hear the story of how she had spoken to the president and stood on stage before the whole nation. She was overwhelmed by the sudden flood of kindness, unsure how to react, her heart caught between joy and disbelief. She never sought attention or recognition, yet here she was, the center of it all. For once, people looked at her not as a burden but as a symbol of something greater. She thanked them quietly, offering shy smiles, but inside she wondered how long this change would last. At the bakery the shift was most dramatic. The owner, who once treated her with disdain, now bent over backward to show respect. He introduced her to customers with forced enthusiasm, telling them, "This is our Maria, our pride." He raised her wages for the first time in 2 decades and gave her lighter tasks, though she noticed it was not kindness but fear that drove him, fear of losing someone the president himself had honored. Maria accepted his gestures but no longer felt bound to his approval. For the first time she understood she had choices. The medal she had been given rested in a small wooden box on her table at home, and each time she looked at it she felt a surge of courage she had never known before. That courage began to shape her thoughts in new ways. Perhaps she did not have to spend the rest of her life behind the bakery counter. Perhaps her story was only beginning. Soon she began receiving invitations from schools, community centers, and women's groups asking her to speak. At first she refused, terrified at the idea of standing before a crowd. She was no speaker, she told herself, just a simple woman. But eventually, persuaded by a group of local teachers, she agreed to visit a classroom. When she stood before the children, their eager faces turned toward her, she trembled. But as she spoke about her life, the long hours of work, the pain of being called worthless, the phone call that changed everything, something inside her blossomed. The children listened in silence, their eyes wide, and when she finished they erupted in applause. Many came forward to hug her, thanking her for showing them that even the simplest life had value. In that moment, Maria realized her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been overlooked or dismissed, and it carried a power she could not ignore. Word spread, and soon Maria found herself traveling beyond her town, visiting other villages, speaking at gatherings and meeting people who told her their own stories of struggle. Farmers who had labored for generations without recognition, widows who worked day and night to raise children alone, laborers whose hands bore the weight of their nation's progress, all came to her, finding strength in her quiet courage. Maria listened to them, embraced them, and reminded them they were not invisible. Her humility touched hearts wherever she went, and people began to call her not worthless but a voice for the voiceless. She carried that role with grace, though she often lay awake at night wondering how she had been chosen for it. She had never sought power or influence, but fate had placed it in her hands, and she felt the responsibility deeply. One day she received another call from the president's office. This time it was not to honor her, but to ask her to join a new national council dedicated to improving the lives of workers like her. The idea left her stunned. She had no education beyond the basics, no knowledge of politics or governance, yet the president insisted that her perspective was needed. "You represent millions," the aide told her. "Your life gives you an understanding that no textbook can teach." Maria hesitated for days, frightened by the thought of stepping into such an unfamiliar world. But then she remembered the faces of the children who had listened to her, the tears of the widows who had thanked her, and she knew she could not turn away. With trembling hands she accepted the invitation. Her new role took her frequently to the capital, where she sat in rooms filled with officials, economists, and ministers. At first she felt out of place, sitting silently while others spoke in terms she barely understood. But slowly she realized her strength was not in technical knowledge but in truth. She told them what life was like for those who woke before dawn to work, for those who endured humiliation in silence, for those who had been branded worthless all their lives. Her words were plain, but they cut through the polished speeches of others, carrying a weight that could not be ignored. The president himself often praised her for reminding them of the people they served. Maria's confidence grew, and though she never stopped feeling humble, she no longer felt small. Back in her town, life continued, but nothing was as it once had been. People who had once looked down on her now sought her advice. Young women came to her, asking how to be strong in the face of cruelty. Men who once mocked her now lowered their heads in shame when they passed her on the street. Maria treated them all with the same kindness she had always shown, but inside she carried a quiet triumph. She had proven them wrong, not with anger, not with revenge, but with dignity. And though the whispers of the past sometimes returned in her mind, she no longer believed them. The word worthless had lost its power. As months turned into years, Maria's story spread far and wide. Newspapers wrote about her journey, television channels featured her interviews, and ordinary people spoke her name with respect. She became more than a symbol. She became a reminder that no life, no matter how simple, was without value. And though fame had touched her, she remained the same at heart, rising early, keeping her home modest, speaking with humility. She never forgot where she came from, and perhaps that was why her story continued to inspire. For Maria, the greatest change was not in how others saw her, but in how she finally saw herself. She was no longer invisible, no longer broken by cruel words. She had discovered her own worth, and in doing so, she had given countless others the courage to discover theirs as well. Maria's new responsibilities did not erase the challenges of her life. Instead, they revealed new ones she had never imagined facing. As she sat in the capital at long wooden tables surrounded by officials, she realized how deeply injustice was woven into the everyday lives of people like her. Reports were read, charts displayed, policies debated, but behind every number was a human being struggling to survive, and often those voices were absent from the room. Maria made it her mission to bring those voices into the heart of power. She spoke of mothers who skipped meals so their children could eat, of laborers who worked 12 hours a day and still returned home with nothing, of old men forced to toil long past their strength because no one else would care for them. At first, many officials dismissed her as a sentimental distraction, but over time they could not ignore her persistence. Her words carried the weight of lived truth, and when she spoke, the room fell silent. She began to notice small shifts, policies written with greater compassion, programs designed to actually reach the forgotten. Though the work was slow and often exhausting, Maria felt a sense of purpose greater than anything she had known. Back in her town, the changes in her life were met with mixed feelings. While most people admired her and felt proud that someone from their humble community was shaping the nation, there were a few who resented her rise. Old grudges surfaced in whispers that she had abandoned her roots, that she had become too proud. Maria heard these whispers but chose not to let them wound her. She knew better now. Worthless people did not sit with presidents. Worthless people did not inspire crowds. If some still clung to their bitterness, it was a reflection of their own hearts, not hers. She walked through the streets with her head higher than before, greeting everyone with the same gentle humility. Those who hated her could not shake her anymore. One evening, after returning from a council meeting, Maria was invited to speak at a gathering of workers in the capital. The hall was filled with men and women whose lives mirrored her own, people who baked bread, stitched clothes, built roads, cleaned offices. They looked at her not as an untouchable figure but as one of their own who had somehow stepped into a brighter light. Maria stood before them, her hands trembling slightly, and told them her story once more. But this time she added something more. They called me worthless. For years I believed them. But I learned that no one can take away your worth unless you let them. We are the ones who hold up this country. Our work feeds it, clothes it, keeps it standing. We are not invisible. We are not worthless. We are the foundation. Her words struck like fire through the room. People cheered, cried, and clapped until the walls echoed. Maria realized in that moment that her voice was not only a gift but a weapon, a gentle one but powerful enough to break chains of silence. Opportunities continued to unfold. She was invited to international conferences, where she met people from other countries who carried stories as heavy as her own. A seamstress from one land, a coal miner from another, a teacher from a war-torn village. They shared their struggles and triumphs, and Maria listened with compassion. She spoke little compared to others, but when she did, her words carried authenticity that no polished diplomat could replicate. Journalists began to write about her as the voice of the ordinary. Maria felt humbled, almost bewildered, that her life had stretched so far from the bakery walls she once thought would be her prison forever. But despite the honor, Maria never allowed herself to forget the quiet pain of her earlier years. She often returned to her old neighborhood, walking the same cracked sidewalks, sitting in the same bakery where she had once been scolded and shamed. She greeted the new workers warmly, reminding them that their labor mattered, that their dignity was real. Many of them could hardly believe that the woman who now spoke with presidents still came back to sit among them. Yet Maria insisted on it. She said it reminded her who she truly was and why she had been chosen. Power, she believed, meant nothing if it disconnected her from her roots. As her influence grew, Maria also became a mentor to young girls who struggled under the weight of harsh words. She gathered them in community halls, listened to their stories of being mocked for being poor, uneducated, or quiet, and told them what she wished someone had told her long ago: "You are not defined by their cruelty. Your worth is not decided by their laughter. You have strength even if the world refuses to see it yet." Many of those girls carried her words into their own lives, walking taller, refusing to bend under insults. For Maria, that was the greatest reward, watching others rise from the shadows of doubt into the light of self-belief. Yet even as her days filled with travel, speeches, and meetings, Maria remained a woman of simplicity at heart. She still cooked her own meals when she was home, still mended her clothes with careful stitches, still lit candles at night to pray for strength. She never let the medal or the recognition blind her to the truth that she was just one among millions who struggled. She often whispered to herself at night, "I am still Maria, the baker, the daughter of simple parents, the woman who once believed she was nothing." This humility kept her grounded, and it was what made people trust her. They knew she would not abandon them because she never stopped being one of them. The president himself, in private meetings, often thanked her. "You remind us why we lead," he told her once, his eyes weary with the burdens of office. "You keep us close to the people when it is too easy to drift away." Maria never knew what to say to such words, so she only smiled and replied softly, "I only speak what I lived." But deep inside she felt a quiet pride. She had gone from being a shadow in a bakery to a guiding light for her nation's leaders. The world had branded her worthless, but now the highest authority admitted he needed her voice. It was proof, not just for her but for everyone like her, that dignity could rise from the lowest places. And so Maria carried on, walking between two worlds, the humble simplicity of her past and the bright responsibilities of her present. She no longer feared the whispers, because she had learned that the world's cruelest words could be undone by truth. She had been told she was worthless, but now she lived as living proof that no human being ever truly is. As the years moved forward, Maria began to notice the subtle but undeniable way her life had changed. She was no longer the forgotten worker hidden in the back of a bakery, yet she never allowed the recognition to cloud her sense of self. What startled her most was not the respect she now received from strangers, but the shift in how her own neighbors treated her. People who once mocked her now sought her advice on matters of work, family, and even disputes. They came not because she had studied law or economics, but because they trusted her honesty. Maria found herself stepping into a role she never asked for. She had become a kind of moral compass for those around her. When disputes arose between neighbors, they often asked her to mediate, certain that her words would be fair. It was not power that made her voice strong, it was the weight of her lived truth. Still, Maria often thought back to the bakery. The smell of flour and yeast lingered in her memory, along with the sting of cruel words that once haunted her. She sometimes walked past the bakery and saw the new workers bustling inside. A few recognized her, their eyes lighting with awe as they waved shyly. She always waved back, never forgetting that she had once stood in their place, feeling invisible. Sometimes she even bought bread, not because she needed it but because it reminded her of where she came from. The bakery owner, older now and less sharp than before, always tried to act kind, but Maria could see the regret in his eyes. He knew how he had treated her, and he knew the world had seen her rise while he remained behind the same counter. Maria never sought revenge. She greeted him politely, spoke with grace, and carried herself with quiet dignity. In truth, his treatment had been part of the path that shaped her, and she no longer carried bitterness. Her work with the council deepened over time. She learned how policies were drafted, how budgets were allocated, and how easily the poor were forgotten in the language of numbers. Each time officials discussed statistics, she reminded them of names, faces, and families. She grew more confident in asking hard questions. Was this policy going to reach the widows she knew by name? Would this program ease the hunger of the farmers she had spoken with? Could this decision protect the dignity of workers whose backs bent under the nation's progress? At first, her questions were dismissed as naive, but she refused to stay silent. Gradually, even the most hardened officials began to pause before answering, because they knew Maria's words cut to the heart of what truly mattered. With time, her influence stretched further. She was asked to lead initiatives that provided scholarships for children of laborers, medical aid for women who worked long hours, and microloans for those who wished to start small businesses. Maria traveled to villages where women wept as they received tools or seeds that could transform their lives. She watched children laugh as they opened new books for the first time. She saw hope flicker in places where despair had taken root for generations. And each time she thought of the day she had once sat shivering in the dark, believing she was worthless. It seemed impossible that she was now part of building hope for so many. But Maria never forgot. It was precisely because she had known despair so intimately that she understood the power of hope. Her personal life remained simple. She never married, never had children of her own, but she became a mother figure to many. Young people often visited her home, seeking guidance. Some brought food, others brought flowers, though Maria always insisted she needed nothing but their company. She told them stories not of her achievements but of her struggles. The nights she cried alone, the mornings she rose before dawn to face scorn, the years she believed her life had no meaning. She wanted them to understand that her strength was not born from recognition but from survival. "If I could endure it, so can you," she often said, her voice gentle but steady. These conversations became a source of strength for many, and Maria began to realize that her greatest gift was not the medal on her wall but the courage she could ignite in others. Yet fame also brought challenges. There were those who tried to exploit her name for their own gain. Some politicians sought to use her image in their campaigns, twisting her story into slogans. Others criticized her, claiming she had been elevated beyond her worth, that she was being used as a symbol while real problems remained unsolved. Maria heard these criticisms and though they stung, she never let them break her. She reminded herself that the voices of doubt had always been there, only now they wore different clothes. Once they were neighbors whispering behind her back, now they were commentators on television. But she knew the truth, her worth did not depend on their approval. She continued her work quietly, refusing to be swayed by either flattery or scorn. One winter evening, Maria received another personal call from the president. His voice carried the same warmth she remembered from the first time. He thanked her for her service, for reminding leaders of their duty, and for showing the nation that greatness could be found in the simplest lives. He told her that her story had reached beyond the country's borders, inspiring people in faraway places. Maria listened, tears filling her eyes. She never imagined her life could ripple so far. When she hung up the phone, she sat for a long time in silence, holding her hands together, whispering a prayer of gratitude. It was not the honor that touched her most, but the realization that the pain she once thought meaningless had become the very thing that gave her life purpose. As the night deepened, she stepped outside her home and looked at the stars. She thought of her parents, of the little girl she once had been, mocked and overlooked, of the young woman who had worked with blistered hands and a bowed head. If only she could tell that girl what she now knew, that worth is not given by others, that dignity cannot be stolen, and that even the most broken life can bloom into something extraordinary. She smiled softly, the cold wind brushing her face, and for the first time in years she felt complete peace. As time passed, Maria's life became a balance between recognition and the simplicity she refused to abandon. She continued to travel for meetings and gatherings, but she always returned to her small home, where the walls still bore the cracks of age and the furniture remained plain. She had the means now to live in luxury if she wished, yet she never sought it. The comfort she desired was not in material wealth but in the warmth of human connection, in the knowledge that her life now touched others in ways she never dreamed possible. Even as the world hailed her, she remained the same Maria who once rose before dawn, who once endured insults, who once believed she was nothing. What had changed was not her essence, but her understanding of it. She knew now she had been worthy all along even when no one saw it. This realization gave her a strength that radiated wherever she went, and people felt it in her presence. The council work grew more demanding as she gained trust among leaders. She was given a seat at more important discussions, and though she had no formal education in law or economics, she had something the others lacked: unfiltered experience of what life at the bottom was truly like. Whenever decisions were about to be made, officials often turned to her, asking quietly what she thought ordinary people would feel. Maria always answered with honesty, reminding them that behind every policy were real families. Sometimes her answers delayed the processes, sometimes they challenged the comfortable assumptions in the room, but she never wavered. She had learned that silence was the greatest form of betrayal for those who had no voice, and she refused to be silent again. Her town, too, began to transform because of her presence. More resources flowed in, schools were repaired, and medical camps were organized for those who had long been neglected. Roads were fixed, small businesses received support, and suddenly the place once seen as forgotten came alive with new energy. People credited Maria, though she always insisted it was the collective effort of many. Yet everyone knew her influence was the spark that drew the nation's eyes to their little town. Mothers who once scolded their daughters for being too simple now pointed to Maria as proof that humility and resilience could carry someone further than arrogance. Children who once laughed at her now grew up telling stories of her courage. The word worthless, which had once followed her like a shadow, vanished completely, replaced by reverence. But with the recognition also came a new kind of burden. Maria felt the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders. Wherever she went, people looked to her as though she carried the solution to their struggles. They believed her presence alone could fix what had been broken for generations. Maria understood their faith, but it frightened her too. She was only human, and she knew she could not solve every problem. At night, she often sat alone by the light of a small lamp, her hands folded, whispering to herself that she would do what she could, but that she must accept her limits. In those moments, she remembered the years when she had prayed not for greatness but for strength to survive one more day. Those prayers, she realized, had carried her here, and she trusted they would carry her still. The president invited her once more to the Capitol, this time not for ceremony but for counsel. He asked her opinion on national reforms for laborers, on programs for widows, on ways to restore dignity to forgotten workers. Maria spoke plainly, never afraid to remind him that promises meant nothing if they did not reach the poorest homes. To her surprise, he listened carefully, taking notes, thanking her for her bluntness. "You are our conscience," he told her softly, and Maria felt tears rise in her eyes. To think that the same woman who once trembled under the insults of a bakery owner was now the conscience of a nation seemed impossible, yet it was real. She carried those words back home with a humility that never left her, knowing that the trust placed in her was both an honor and a responsibility she must never betray. One spring morning, Maria was invited to address a gathering broadcast live across the nation. She stood before cameras, the weight of millions watching, and spoke not with polished rhetoric but with the plain truth of her life. She told the story of a young girl who grew up with nothing, who was called useless, who believed the lies until one day the world reminded her of her worth. She spoke of how every person, no matter how hidden or humble, carried dignity that deserved respect. Her voice, steady and sincere, carried across radios and televisions into homes of the rich and the poor alike. That night, letters and messages poured in from across the country. People thanking her, telling her their own stories of struggle, confessing that they had begun to believe in themselves again because of her words. Maria sat reading them late into the night, tears falling freely, realizing her life had become more than survival. It had become a lantern lighting the path for others. And yet, despite all of this, Maria never stopped being herself. She still woke early, still swept her small home, still walked through her town with the same quiet smile. Fame never hardened her, nor did respect make her arrogant. She remained the woman who once knelt in prayer in a cold, dark room, believing she had no future. She carried that memory like a scar that reminded her who she truly was. But unlike before, the scar no longer caused pain, it was proof of her strength. She had lived through scorn, endured despair, and discovered that worth was never something others could give or take. Worth lived within her, and it lived within every person she met. This truth, more than any medal or recognition, was her greatest treasure. Maria's life had grown into something far beyond what she could have imagined, yet she never stopped reflecting on how it all began. There were nights when she sat alone, the world outside quiet, the lamp burning faintly on her wooden table, and she replayed the moments that had shaped her. The sting of insults, the endless days of labor, the times she went hungry because others dismissed her, these memories did not fade. Instead, they lived within her like roots that reminded the tree of where it had grown. She knew that if she ever allowed herself to forget those days, she would lose the very thing that gave her voice its power. The world listened to her now because she was real, because she spoke not from theory but from scars. And while others polished their speeches to perfection, Maria spoke from the heart, raw and unshaped, and that was why people believed her. One afternoon she was asked to travel to another province where women still suffered under systems that silenced them. She walked into a hall filled with hundreds of them, their eyes heavy with stories untold. Many did not believe anyone would care about their struggles. Some carried bruises not just on their bodies but deep in their spirits. Maria stood before them, her simple dress and calm face a mirror of themselves. She told them of her own journey, of being called worthless, of being abandoned by respect and hope, and of the day she realized her worth had been there all along. As she spoke, silence fell over the room, then tears, then a rising murmur of voices repeating her words softly, as if claiming them for themselves. Women who had been beaten down by years of neglect lifted their heads that day, seeing in her proof that their pain could become strength. Maria left that hall with her heart heavy yet hopeful, knowing seeds had been planted that might grow long after she was gone. But as her voice spread, so too did criticism. There were those who mocked her simplicity, calling her naive, saying she lacked the sophistication to lead discussions of national importance. They accused her of being a symbol rather than a thinker, a woman propped up by pity rather than true capability. Maria heard these words whispered in corridors, printed in newspapers, sometimes even shouted directly to her face by those who could not stand the idea that someone like her held influence. At first, the sting returned, sharp and familiar, dragging her back to the helplessness of her younger years. But she remembered the president's call, the faces of the women she had spoken to, the letters from strangers thanking her. And she realized something powerful: their insults no longer defined her. She had lived through far worse and survived. Now their words slid off her like rain on stone. She walked taller not because she felt invincible but because she knew who she was. Her family, too, began to see her differently. Relatives who once distanced themselves out of shame now visited her with pride, telling neighbors they were connected to her. At first, Maria struggled with this sudden shift. She remembered clearly how some of them had laughed when she was younger, how they had whispered that she would amount to nothing. It hurt to think that only now, after the president's recognition, they claimed her. Yet Maria's heart was not one of bitterness. She welcomed them, listened to their stories, and treated them with the same kindness she always had. If life had taught her anything, it was that anger chained the soul, while forgiveness freed it. She chose freedom not just for herself, but for those who had hurt her too. The president himself continued to rely on her insight, sometimes calling her personally late at night to ask what she thought of a policy in progress. Each time the phone rang, Maria's heart skipped, not out of fear but wonder. How had her life turned into this? She never became used to it, never allowed herself to think she deserved such importance. Instead, she approached each call with humility, always careful to speak not as someone above others but as the same woman who had once stood in line for bread, who had once scrubbed floors until her hands cracked. She told the truth even when it was unpopular, even when it risked losing favor. Her loyalty was not to power but to people, and she carried that conviction like a shield. Despite her growing role, Maria kept her life simple. She still visited the bakery where she once worked, though now the owner bowed respectfully when she entered. Some said she should never return to the place that once caused her so much pain, but Maria believed differently. She wanted to show that past wounds did not control her future. By walking through those doors again, she proved not just to others but to herself that she had overcome. Each loaf of bread she bought there became a quiet act of victory, a reminder that she had turned shame into strength. The owner, once harsh and dismissive, tried to apologize, stumbling over words. Maria only smiled and told him she had already forgiven him long ago. That forgiveness was not for him but for her own peace. Her name began to appear in textbooks, in lessons for children about resilience and dignity. Students wrote essays about her, teachers used her as an example of how ordinary lives could change history. Maria never thought of herself as history, yet she could not deny the truth of it. She had become a chapter in her country's story. When she saw young girls walking with confidence, speaking boldly, she felt a quiet pride knowing she had helped carve that path. She did not seek statues or monuments, but she saw them in every lifted chin, every steady voice that no longer trembled. That was her legacy, not marble or stone but lives renewed. And still, through it all, Maria remained grounded. She watered the small plants outside her home, cooked her meals with the same care, and found joy in the laughter of children playing nearby. Fame had not stolen her peace because she had never sought fame in the first place. What she had always wanted was dignity, and now that she had found it, she shared it with others. The woman who had once been branded worthless had become a symbol of worth itself, not because she changed into someone new, but because she finally believed in who she had always been. Maria's journey came full circle one quiet evening when she returned to the small village where her life had begun. The sun was setting low, casting long shadows over the dusty road she once walked barefoot as a child. The same houses stood there, though older and worn, their paint faded, their roofs patched with rusted metal. For years she had carried memories of humiliation tied to this place, memories of laughter at her expense, of whispers calling her useless. Now, as she stepped onto the familiar path, the villagers looked at her with different eyes. Children ran forward, some shy, some bold, pointing and whispering her name. Old neighbors stood in their doorways, nodding respectfully. Even those who once dismissed her now greeted her with warmth. Maria felt an ache rise in her chest, not of pain but of something deeper, a reconciliation between the girl who had once cried in silence here and the woman who returned standing tall. She was invited into the old community hall where gatherings used to take place, the same hall where she had once stood at the back, invisible and unwanted. Now the chairs were arranged for her, and the people filled the space to hear her speak. As she stood at the front, she paused before saying anything. Her eyes roamed the wooden walls, cracked but familiar, and for a moment she felt she was that young girl again, unnoticed. Then she saw the faces waiting for her words, the hope in their eyes, and she realized how much had changed. She spoke simply as always. She told them she had never been extraordinary, that she had no secret talent or powerful connections. What she had was belief, the decision to rise after falling, to keep walking when the road was heavy. She reminded them that dignity was not given by others but discovered within oneself. Her voice filled the room not with grandeur but with truth, and the villagers, once skeptical of her worth, now listened as though every word was a lantern lit inside them. Afterward, an elderly woman approached her, hands trembling, eyes watery. She confessed she had once been among those who mocked Maria, joining the laughter to hide her own fear of being targeted. She said she had carried shame for years, unable to forget the cruelty. Maria took her hands gently, squeezed them, and said she bore no anger, that what mattered was not the cruelty of yesterday but the compassion of today. The woman broke down crying and others joined, offering apologies, some quietly, some openly. Maria received them all with grace, her heart at peace. In that moment she understood something profound. Forgiveness was not only about freeing herself, but about giving others a chance to heal too. Her return to the village was not just symbolic, it became a turning point for the people there. Inspired by her presence, they began to organize efforts to improve their lives. Young women asked for education programs, men volunteered to repair community spaces, and families resolved to treat one another with more dignity. Maria did not dictate their path, she simply reminded them of what was already within their power. Change, she told them, begins not with governments or leaders but with the courage of individuals. And as she left that hall, she felt the air lighter, as if a long shadow had finally lifted from the place. In the years that followed, Maria's influence continued to grow, though she never allowed it to overwhelm her sense of self. She traveled to other countries, sharing her story on global stages. Audiences across oceans listened to the woman who once had nothing, now speaking with authority born not of privilege but of lived truth. Reporters asked her how she endured, scholars wrote analyses of her life, leaders praised her as an example of resilience. Yet through it all, Maria's message remained the same. Worth is not bestowed by power, nor diminished by suffering. Worth is the quiet fire inside every human being, waiting to be believed. She never allowed her voice to be polished into slogans. She kept it plain, unadorned, so that it belonged to everyone. Her later years were marked by peace rather than struggle. She did not chase the spotlight, though it often found her. Instead, she dedicated her time to mentoring young women, sitting with them over tea, listening to their fears, offering wisdom gently. She told them not to aim to be her but to be themselves, stronger and truer with every step. Many of them carried her words into their own lives, becoming teachers, doctors, leaders, and mothers who raised daughters with confidence. Maria watched this ripple of strength spread and felt content knowing that her legacy was alive in living hearts, not carved in stone. There were still moments of loneliness, evenings when she sat by the window listening to the wind outside, remembering the girl she once was. At times she even missed her old struggles, not for their pain but for the raw clarity they gave her. Success had brought comfort, but it was hardship that had carved her soul. She kept those memories alive, sometimes writing them down in a notebook no one else saw. In those pages she poured her heart, the bitterness she once carried, the nights she nearly gave up, the trembling hope that refused to die. Perhaps one day those writings would be read, perhaps not, but for Maria they were a private map of how far she had come. When her time finally neared, Maria was not afraid. She had lived fully, not by chasing perfection but by embracing imperfection and turning it into strength. Surrounded by people who loved her, she spent her last days sharing laughter, telling stories, and reminding everyone that they too were worthy. She passed away quietly, not in despair but in peace, leaving behind not riches but a legacy of courage and compassion. And when news of her death spread, countless voices rose to honor her. Streets filled with candles, prayers, and songs, not of mourning alone but of gratitude. People said she had given them permission to believe in themselves, and that belief would never die. Maria's story became timeless, retold from generation to generation. Children who never met her knew her name, not as a distant hero but as proof that even the most ordinary life can change the world. She was remembered not as flawless but as real, not as unreachable but as human. And in the quiet corners of the world, where someone felt unseen or unworthy, her voice seemed to echo still. You are more than their judgment, you are more than your pain, you are worthy. The end.